Hello and welcome to the National World War II Museum's podcast series, Service on Celluloid. This podcast is brought to you through the generous support of the Albert and Ethel Hertzstein Charitable Foundation. Each week, our in-house experts sit down with special guests to discuss depictions of World War II on film. Sit back and get ready for a lively debate that will reveal the good and bad of how Hollywood shows the 20th century's most dramatic event. Just a reminder before we move on, for one last time this week, you can now find us on Stitcher. Just navigate over there and search for Service on Celluloid, and you'll find us. My name is Seth Paradin, historian and digital content manager here at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. And our special guests for today's episode are Colin Makehamson, Assistant Director of Education for Curriculum here at the museum.
Hey, Seth.
Kate Fitzgerald, Distance Learning Specialist.
Thanks for having me.
And last, but certainly not least, Tommy Lofton, Director of the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum.
Hey, guys.
Today we will be discussing the 1945 film, The Story of G.I. Joe. Story of G.I. Joe focuses on the writings and experiences of Ernie Pyle, the celebrated and much-loved columnist who embedded himself with the mud-crunching foot soldiers throughout most of World War II. The film is often classified as a tribute to the ordinary G.I., whom Pyle loved so very much, told through his voice as he watched his soldiers throughout the North African and Italian campaigns. Story of G.I. Joe stars Burgess Meredith as Ernie Pyle and Robert Mitchum as Lieutenant, later Captain, Bill Walker. The film was directed by William Wellman, written by Leopold Atlas, Guy Endore, and Philip Stevenson. The film was nominated for several Academy Awards, winning none of them. The film was both a critical and financial success. So, as we always start, and Colin, I'll start with you.
Sure.
In your opinion, how accurate is Story of G.I. Joe?
It's accurate, at least in parts, and I can understand why it's not accurate completely insofar as Ernie Pyle was in North Africa with these guys that he wants to talk about, the 18th Infantry, but then following them to North Africa and into Sicily rather, and Italy. There was a different divisions that he would be following, but it would disrupt the continuity of the film to say bye-bye to those old characters and here are some new ones to get acquainted with.
Yeah. Tommy, what about you?
Yeah, I think Colin, hit the nail on the head there. I mean, I think it's extremely accurate film. To me, it's one of the best films to come out from the World War II era, especially to tell you the story of the GI and the G.I. Joe experience. You're right, there is some liberties taken a little bit with the storyline and with the unit that he's following, but I think even with that, there's a lot of true life experiences and life of an everyday soldier that are very well reflected in this film. I still think it's one of the best.
Yeah. Kate?
I agree with Tommy on that one. As I was watching it, I kept thinking about how probably accurate it was and what it actually felt like to be a grunt in, Italy or really anywhere in North Africa or Europe. And that's probably what it looked, felt like, smelt like. So I thought it was pretty accurate.
Yeah, I would agree with everybody here. I think, like you said, Colin, the whole 18th Infantry thing, that is the first unit that he did, what he was embedded with in North Africa, and he was with them at Kasserine Pass. But after that, he was separated. I think he went to Sicily with them, too, if I'm not mistaken.
I sure can't remember.
I don't know. But either way.
He did, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, either way, when he went off to Italy, he was with the 34th and then the 36th, the ID, and a couple other units, too, but those were the two main ones. But aside from that, I think it's really accurate in terms, and we'll get to this later, and what it shows, day-to-day GI life in the Italian theater, and North Africa, too. So on that note, one of the very first scenes in the movie is the American defeat at Kasserine Pass. And this is something we discuss here at the museum in our exhibits. But what are your thoughts on how Kasserine Pass is depicted in the movie? Anybody?
For me, I think this film, I love the beginning, actually, even before they get into Kasserine Pass. They're showing a very green United States Army. They're entering, they're getting in trucks. It's almost like they're going to summer camp or to, some fun Boy Scout camp thing or something, and they happen to have guns with them. It's very laid back. They're jovial. They're joking with each other. And then you see the aircraft come in and the faces of the men when someone finally gets killed. And that seems to be where you start to see that transition of the cast slowly, and you start hearing references of death and stuff like that. When it gets into Kasserine, I think it's a hard battle to address. It's a chaotic battle, and I like that they spend a lot of time on the lack of communication and the fact that they're not able to reach people, several times throughout the movie, even with communication and other things. And I think they actually do a pretty good job for that battle, especially in the chaos and that I guess the fear even in a sense too, but really getting into the chaos and the greenness of the U.S. Army at that time.
I would agree with that 100%, and that the way they show the GIs in the beginning of the film, they're kind of happy-go-lucky. They don't know what the heck they're getting into. They're very green. They're green as grass, and once once that first casualty is sustained, that there's something to that. But even then, they're still kind of, they're sitting there listening to Artie Shaw in the desert and all this. It's just this, hey, this is a lark kind of a thing. And then Cass-Pass comes and it shocks them to the core. And the depiction of that, they show it as a night battle, and obviously parts of it was fought at night, but the whole battle was not fought at night. So there is that inaccuracy there. But I think the filmmaker Wellman decided to, and I'm guessing here, maybe I'm wrong, but I think he decided to show that most of the battle was at night, because anything at night, any combat at night is chaotic. Even the best laid plans they generally hit the fan when the stuff goes down. So,
and I agree with Tommy. It shows really just the chaos and disorder of the troops as they meet this well trained veteran army. It doesn't really tell you what Kasserine Pass is, other than sort of just a baptism of fire. It doesn't tell the fallout of American leadership in North Africa and the changes that they make in its aftermath. But it does show that this small group that Pyle is embedded with, they're not ready, and they're at this point not up to the task ahead of them.
No, not at all.
And I think they don't, it's not meant to be about Kasserine Pass, to your point, Colin. I think the other thing, too, with that is it's just a couple of years after the battle, too. So I guess they feel like they don't have to go into too much of that because it's still fresh with the American public who would be watching this. And I think, to the comments about night battle, there were some night movements, if I remember correctly. I'm a little rusty on my Kasserine Pass compared to what I used to know about it. But I do remember some points where other divisions were getting hit pretty heavily in the 1st Division, and other units were having to move up or move forward in the middle of the evening.
Yeah, the night actions are, and that's what I was saying, is I think that the whole decision to depict it as a night battle adds to the chaos and confusion.
Oh, totally.
And when he's trying to get these people on the radio and he can't get anybody on the radio, well, that was accurate because they were cut off. They got surrounded. We didn't take a lot of prisoners. We had a lot of prisoners taken at Kasserine Pass.
A lot of deaths, too.
Yeah.
So as I was watching this movie, I had to look up Kasserine Pass, and I kept remembering that I had heard it somewhere, but I could not remember where, but it wasn't school. And then I realized that it's brought up twice in the Call of Duty Medal of Honor video game, and that's when it hit me. I was like, that's where I'd heard of Kasserine Pass before. But from what my research in the last couple of days, it looks pretty accurately depicted. And Tommy, you brought up at the beginning when we're introduced to, the Green Army, the Fresh Army, we're also introduced then to my favorite character, and that is, of course, the dog.
Well, and there's something to that, and I think, there's a lot of reason they did that. And you think about it, I'll even speak from my own experiences. My grandfather was in the 2nd Infantry Division. He landed in Normandy within 12 to 24 hours of the invasion. And there were 2 French dogs that were out there in the middle of nowhere that they adopted, and they named them Pierre and Andre. And those dogs, you see them in photos from the Battle of the Bulge, you see them in Pilsen, Czechoslovakia at the end of the war, and they added to that. Eventually he had a sable German Shepherd named Lip.
The only kind of dog that there is.
And, he adopted Lip. And so there's tons of photos of dogs in a lot of the collection you'll see here, and even at my museum, the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum. It's amazing how many, there's a lot of dogs and abandoned animals out there and cats, other stuff that need new homes. They see people coming and they have food, so why not? And I think that's actually great that they put the dog in the film, and then it gets passed from soldier to soldier too, as some of the owners, quote unquote, end up getting killed.
But I think it's accurate in that soldiers generally tend to take to animals because they're tender and they give him some sort of companionship, some sort of warm companionship. And this little dog, it was an Arab, I think is his name, is he does that to all the soldiers throughout the film. And it's a very common thing, like you said. You see pictures of guys with soldiers in the Pacific and in Europe all the time with dogs and cats and monkeys and all kinds of weird things. But
and there's something else I kind of wanted to comment on with this is children. I like that they show the depiction of children in this film, and there is something interesting within the 34th Division and a few other divisions I know. They actually had kids who were orphans they ended up taking with them and hiding them in vehicles. And a couple of GIs actually adopted them and brought them home, or brought them home and adopted them. And so seeing the children in this film reminded me of a few stories of soldiers I met in the 34th Division years ago that I think one of them even, snuck a kid onto a ship, brought him, and it was like halfway back to the New York Harbor when they discovered this kid was on board. They weren't going to turn around, and as soon as he got in the States, they adopted him. And I know that happened again with the 2nd Division and a few other units out there too.
There's a very touching scene, I think it's about midway through the movie, when the column is moving through a destroyed town, and there's a little boy asking for cigarettes.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about.
And, the GI's not going to give him a pack of smokes, but he gives him what one assumes to be a bar of chocolate or whatever it is. And the kid tastes it, and then he runs up behind the soldier, and he grabs his hand, and he holds his hand as he's walking down there. I mean, that's touching, but it's accurate, too,
Yeah.
These kids very well may have lost their parents and had nobody in the world. And, the American GI, while they are not perfect by any means, certainly has always had a tender heart for children.
And I like that the director, if I can move forward a couple of years, when he makes the film Battleground, includes children again. You see that as another component of his, another feature success, I would say, for him. You see kids again as a central part of that movie in a few places.
So does the film accurately portray, and I know the answer to this, but does the film accurately portray the living conditions and day-to-day of the common GI serving in Italy, what we often term as the forgotten front in the European theater?
Certainly in the Monte Cassino sequences, I mean, it definitely speaks to that almost World War I Western Front style of combat amidst the rubble and destruction. But the thing that seemed most accurate or most powerful to me were when the men were, sort of hunkered down, almost underground, reading this proclamation that, all of Uncle Sam's boys will have turkey and cranberry for Christmas, and they're sitting there eating these cold rations. And so that really spoke to me, saying, like, this is, sort of a forgotten story, or, a bitter one at that.
There is some classic GI humor when they say that, because the guy Dondero is eating his sea rats, and he taps the side of the can, and he goes, "Tough skin on this turkey here."
Yeah, I like that.
That is straight GI humor. I think it very accurately portrays the living conditions of these guys. And it wasn't necessarily, I say it was Italy, but it was also North Africa too. Mm-hmm. In the beginning of the movie, they're in the desert. It gets cold at night. And generally, people don't think of that when they think of the desert. They think of heat and, dry conditions. But it does get cold out there. These guys are laying there in the middle of the desert under wool blankets, and they're shivering. And then they show them marching down this road, 2 columns. And if you notice, if anybody knows infantry combat tactics, and I think most of us at this table do, they were properly spaced when they were walking down that road. They weren't like your normal Hollywood movie where they're only 6 inches apart.
Well, there's a reason for that.
Yeah, I was going to say, it probably has to do with the fact that they were actually veterans and soldiers.
That's right.
on
That's
active
right.
duty. That's
right. But I mean, it looks good. It's that extra little added realism. But when they're walking down that road in North Africa in that blinding rain, I mean, you can barely see these guys. And how many World War II movies that were made during the war show something like that?
I love the Jeep in that sequence, too.
It comes flying up.
Flying, locks the brakes down, and then it slides probably a good 6 or 8 feet further than where they anticipated that it would stop. But that is something, Jeep drivers, I remember talking to some of those over the years, and if you've driven a World War II Jeep, especially in wet conditions, it's a great vehicle, but it doesn't always stop great, or in the mud, it doesn't always go forward either. There's a lot of side-to-side motion and some unexpected movement with those things, and I love that it showed just little snippets of that throughout the film, and the lingo within this too. And I think there's probably some liberties taken a little bit in stealing some things potentially from Bill Malden and his cartoons, but I do like some of the conversations and the lingo that they have in the desert and the references to was it Axis Sally and some of the other things that they're dealing with in there.
But I think to your point, Colin, the scenes, which the vast majority of the movie is set in and around Monte Cassino, and the fact that they're literally living like animals in holes in the ground.
And to Colin's point too, notice with Monte Cassino too, most of them have beards now. They're not shaving. They're covered in mud. The actors are filthy. It's not what we would think with a Hollywood film today, where there may be a little bit of fuzz or something, but an actor's not gonna cover his face up where you can't recognize him. No, back then you can see where they're a progressive sequence of some of these actors just not caring anymore, and they're really getting into this role with the war's progression.
Oh, they're nasty looking.
Yeah.
I mean, especially towards the end of the Monte Cassino part of the film, Mitchum is, I mean, he is gross. I mean, he's got the beard. His hair is just nasty and funky. He's covered in dirt. His overcoat looks like it's got about a 2-inch thick crust on it of mud. And I mean, that's very accurate for the Italian theater. Any pictures you see, well, not any pictures, but the vast majority of pictures you see from Italy in the winter, they're wading through, damn near knee-deep mud. So this is a very, very accurate thing. And I mean, it didn't snow very often. It was a rainy season. So I mean, the fact that, 3/4 of the scenes in Italy, it's pouring rain is very accurate for that area.
Yeah, I also think, when you think of war, often you think war is ugly, but war is also boring at times. A lot of war movies, you want to go, go, go. Or in this movie, sometimes we're sitting, we're thinking, we're talking, and not doing anything. And that's pretty accurate of a day-to-day life of a grunt, really no matter what war you're talking about.
Yeah, it is. And I mean, there's a lot of little things in here that are very accurate, from the boredom, from the mail call scene. Mm-hmm. When that Jeep later on comes up and they got the big sack of mail and everybody sees it and they hit that thing, just they hit it hard. Mm-hmm. And everybody's asking for mail and some guys get some and the captain, Walker, doesn't. And he's got this dejected look on his face, because if you talk to anybody overseas, that was the lifeline to home was mail. And when you didn't get something, it was devastating until the mail did come. And you hope to God you got something that time too. So it's very, very accurate in a lot of those places. Speaking of places, the preservation of places of cultural significance comes up a lot, like the monastery. And this is an accurate thing. How common would you say that was during the war?
Well, I know Mark Clark didn't want to bomb the abbey, but was overruled by Harold Alexander, the overall Allied commander in Italy. But in a broader sense, other than instances of the Monuments Men saving individual works of art, I don't know. I'm sure if there was a 1,000-year-old Benedictine abbey in between where the United States Army wanted to go, and the fastest way was through it, over it, or amongst its ruins. That's hard math to do, but I'm sure they would do it to weigh the cost of men and material and time versus knocking this thing flat.
Yeah, and I mean that's accurate history. When they ran up against the monastery, they didn't want to destroy it, but they were taking heavy artillery, and they wrongfully assumed that it was a German outpost, and it was not. It has been proven that it was not. And then when we bombed it, when the Army Air Forces bombed it and reduced it to rubble, it actually unfortunately killed a lot of civilians, over 200 civilians, I think. I don't remember the exact number, but it was over 200 civilians. I want to say 229. Don't quote me on that. That were taking refuge there and were killed in the bombing. And then after it was turned to rubble, then the Germans moved in and used it as an observation post. And the Fallschirmjäger held out in there for another, month?
Yeah,
2 months, something like that. So they actually made it worse on themselves. But as far as how common would it be, I don't know. If anybody knows, bark up. But I have no idea. I think, as you said, Colin, I don't think they're going to set out to destroy the Cologne Cathedral. But if, the headquarters of an SS Panzer Division's in there, which of course it wasn't, but I'm just saying hypothetically, then they would have taken it out, to get to their ultimate goal, which of course is winning the war.
Well, I think they also don't want, you don't want to upset the local population either and start completely destroying everything, or they'll start working against you in favor of the enemy. And so I think when they could, I think you're right, Colin and Seth, that, everybody, that they're not going to try to purposely just destroy something, but you're right. I think, Colin, that if it's in the way and they've got to get, if there's no way but through it, they're going to go through it if they have to.
Yeah, no doubt.
Yeah, Tommy, I think you bring up a good point. Like in the chaos of war, there's a few scenes in the movie where there's a random group of soldiers discussing the bombing of churches or not. And there's a few in the movie that they have say, take it down, get it out of our way. And, we have, the luxury of looking back and saying, do take it or not. But majority of us probably, if I'm there on the ground,
Absolutely.
take it out if it needs to go.
Yeah, and I mean, they were fully convinced that their German observers were there, and I mean, it would make sense. I mean, let's be real. I mean, it's
still heavily debated.
It's sitting up there and looking down. I mean, it was a very likely place for them to be. Mm-hmm. And if I'm a ground pounder and I'm taking artillery every friggin' day, yeah, I'm going to want the most obvious place for an artillery observation post to be destroyed. So, yeah, I mean, I don't blame them at all. I'd have done the same damn thing every time. But you talked about it briefly, Kate, and we're going to get to it now. Many of the extras in this film were soldiers, real soldiers. Can you discuss a bit about who they were and how they came to be in this film?
Yeah, so a lot of them were veterans of the Italian campaign that were on their way to the Pacific eventually. And they weren't on leave. They were actually in Southern California. That's where they filmed this. So I wonder how they got all the rain. I kept thinking that in the movie as I was watching it.
Movie magic.
Studios, lots of hoses.
But they were there for like 6 weeks, I think, and they were filming and training at the same time. And then many of them in the movie will go on to fight in the Pacific, along with Ernie Pyle himself.
That's very true.
I wonder if they got double pay, for,
Probably not.
I highly doubt
or
it.
a SAG card or something.
Yeah. I was doing a little reading on that, and it was one of the rare occasions that the United States Army allowed their soldiers to do that for a Hollywood film, and not a training film, but a Hollywood film. And such was the importance and the love for Ernie Pyle and how important it was, and he was. They even let soldiers grow beards for the movie, which is obvious when you see the movie, but that was something that was uncommon. They didn't really do that. The only time soldiers grew beards was in the combat zone, when they could have cared less about shaving, which adds an extra bit of realism to this film. But I think the fact that they are real dog faces in there, it really does add, like you were saying, they're marching down the road at a proper interval, and they're moving properly. They're executing field commands and field orders in a proper way. They're moving like they're supposed to. They're not standing straight up across a field. They're ducking and dodging and bobbing and weaving, and they're doing things that combat veterans do. And it's awesome. It's something that a lot of films don't do. And granted, they had the luxury to do it. But how does this movie compare to other films about grunt life? And we don't just have to compare it to World War II era movies. Let's stick to World War II movies, but let's not just World War II era movies. Any World War II movie made. What do you guys think? How does this compare?
One of the things I liked at least was with even Dondero, I think I'm pronouncing his name right, the character was sort of, I guess, fraternization with the female population. It at least showed in sort of a cheesy and overwrought scene that the American soldier wasn't just thinking about victory and glory at all cost. These guys were lonely. They were alone, seeking solace where they could. And even though it did, like I said, kind of put a humorous and comical face on acts that were usually acts of, economic necessity or even sometimes physical coercion, I was happy to see, even that little interlude, even though it did end with him, speaking perfect Italian and, sweeping this young lady off her feet, I guess.
Well, it's from Brooklyn, man. They're all Italians there, right? Aren't they? I mean, that's what Hollywood has you believe.
I think the actor is like Argentinian or Venezuelan or something, so he pulled it off pretty well.
He sounded good anyway. I think this movie, so William Wellman directed this. And like you said in the beginning, Tommy, he directed my favorite World War II movie, Battleground, which if you go back and to listen to previous episodes of this podcast, you will hear myself and Tommy Lofton talk about the famous 1949 movie, Battleground.
True.
Anyway, Battleground, in my opinion, is the ultimate love letter to the American GI. It's beautiful in every way. And you can tell that Wellman was cutting his teeth, if you will, to paraphrase. He was paying tribute to the GIs in this movie, and what he did in this movie, he excelled at even more in Battleground.
It's almost like there's a part one and a part two for his in his mind, I'm kind of reading into this, but I feel like there's a lot of similar elements. Again, you have kids in both films. You have music in both films. In this film, you have a guy with a harmonica playing Dixie every now and then when they stop, which to me tells me you also have representation of a unit of people who are made up from all different backgrounds and different locations. And you see that in Battleground, too, with a soldier who's always singing silly songs, typically about Texas, if I remember correctly. And, I think that's something that's unique about this film compared to a lot of World War II films as well, is you have those moments of downtime. It's not just constant combat. When you think of some of the series and things that have come out, say like Band of Brothers, Saving Private Ryan, or some other films that, the podcast has even looked at, there's some downtime here and there, but I wouldn't say it's as much as in this film. I feel like it's half combat, half downtime. And
might even be less than that. It might be more downtime than combat.
And that's
frankly.
true.
But I think it we've talked about the living conditions and the things like that, the mud and the muck and the grime and the filth, and it does that. Frankly, I think it does that better than Battleground, really, because Battleground, the guys are a little bit cleaner. Granted, it's a different situation. They were thrown into the Ardennes in the Battle of the Bulge, and it was a little bit different. They weren't fighting their way up the Italian boot, but those guys are a little bit cleaner.
Yeah.
They do get dirty in the movie, and they get dirtier as the movie progresses, but not like these guys.
Well, even the use of archival, where they merge from actors on a set to archival footage use, to me, it actually kind of blends together pretty well in this film. I think they do a good job of that in Battleground. But I think this film in particular, especially when you get into Italy and into Monte Cassino and some of these things, you can actually believe that they're looking toward the Abbey, watching it get destroyed and things like that. And clearly they're not. But
yeah, they're using, most of the archival that they're using there, most of it, not all of it, but most of it they're using is Battle of San Pietro by John Huston, which is a fantastic documentary in its own right. And there's some incredibly awesome archival scenes in there, and they're fed right into this film, and they're fed pretty seamlessly because the terrain, San Pietro, as the crow flies, is really not that far from Monte Cassino. I don't know the exact mileage off the top of my head any longer, but it's really not that far, so it doesn't look very different than the set does. And it's, if you didn't know that you were looking at Houston San Pietro, you probably wouldn't, you wouldn't be able to tell. And I think it does it very well. And, I like the way Pyle has a quote in the movie, which is also a quote, that he wrote. And I think it sums it up quite well. And I'm paraphrasing here and I'm going to get it wrong, but he says something along the lines of, the GI lives so miserably and he dies so miserably. And that is shown in this film. And it's shown very, very well. I don't know if I necessarily agree with this next talking point, but I'm going to say it anyway. The film is somewhat lacking in plot. Why do you think that is, and does it matter? Anybody, go ahead and run with that one.
Yeah, so I guess when I was watching it and I was trying to ask myself what the plot was, it was the road to Rome, which I guess can be considered a plot potentially, or maybe not. But I really think, and it even goes back to this last question, this movie came out in 1945, and it's about a grunt's life. And, maybe people just wanted to know what it was like to be a grunt. Like, World War II touched everybody. Mm-hmm. There was no plot to the war, and he's trying to be accurate as possible. And I think that potentially played into not having a plot.
I see where you're going with that. I disagree with it a little bit in a sense of the film not having a plot. I think actually there's kind of two films in one here. I think you have the story of G.I. Joe, which is the obvious here, but then also the story of Ernie Pyle. And I think that's also interesting because this film, came out in theaters, I guess, right after Ernie Pyle passed away within a few months.
Yeah,
so, but we talked about y'all have talked about other films in here about people like Patton and other figures that were made many years later. It's interesting to me, this is one of the few films probably in history made about a person while they're still living, as far as war films and things go too. And I think, to me, there's sort of two different films in this. There's that story of the journalist and of Ernie Pyle and telling the story of G.I. Joe, but then you also have that perspective of those people potentially watching this to say, that's me, or that's my buddies, or the sons and daughters and family members watching this saying, that's what it was like for you the last few years you haven't been home. Or, we got to assume, too, a lot of people were watching this and their family members hadn't come home yet. They're still waiting on a ship home from...
Or would never come home.
From Europe. Oh, and that, too.
I agree with you, Kate. I'm glad you went there because I think my answer, I wrote it down here. I typed it out as I saw these yesterday, these talking points, and I wanted to write it down before I forgot what I was going to say because my attention span is that of a fly. And I wrote down and I said the GI existence had no plot. And it didn't.
Still doesn't.
That's right.
It's true.
Theirs was, to be cheesy and cliche, theirs was to do and die. And their only plot, if you will, was to continue to breathe. And one of the characters, and I don't remember which one it is, I think it's Don Darrow. And when they're in Monte Cassino and they're in the holes and the caves or whatever it is you want to call those things, the hovels or whatever, he says, or one of them says, sometimes I just get a kick out of breathing. And that is the plot of the movie, in my opinion. And this kind of ties into what we just finished talking about. Both William Wellman and Ernie Pyle had very strong feelings about this film. Can anybody speak to that a bit?
William Wellman, the director of the movie, he was quoted with saying, "This is the only film that I made that I can't watch or look at." Now I'm paraphrasing and not getting it correct. But I really think it had to do with the fact that they used soldiers who they got to know while filming, who then went on and did not make it through the Pacific, and including Ernie Pyle again. And so that when I was researching it really spoke to me that of all the movies, this is the one that he couldn't rewatch over again.
And that's saying something considering the words spoken by William Wellman, because he did do quite a few really, really strong films, not the least of which was this, and as I said later on, Battleground. But
and Eisenhower too, by the way, was a huge fan of this film.
I did not know that.
Pretty sure he called it the greatest film about World War II.
Yeah.
Again, there's some pretty strong words from a pretty strong speaker there for sure.
Can't beat Ike's comments.
Not really. No.
I think in a lot of war movies, you have movies that veterans or active duty soldiers, Marines, whoever can watch and can't watch. I know growing up, my dad was a Marine, and I grew up on Camp Lejeune and Pendleton, and you name it, base, I've been there. And when a movie would come out, my dad would be like, his helmet's not strapped. That would never happen. Things like that. And as watching this movie, things like that didn't appear to me. And I had my dad watch it across the pond in Africa, and we Skyped about it. And he's like, that looks pretty accurate, even though it's years and years ago. Not much has changed. So,
yeah,
that was very good to know.
Good point.
I know Ernie Pyle hated the title. He didn't like the story of G.I. Joe, but then he said, I think he didn't have anything better and he was too lazy to come up with anything better. And I know he was concerned with who was going to play him. I know there was they wanted to have someone who physically resembled him. So they got Burgess Meredith, but I think Leslie Howard was in the running for him for a while before he was shot down and killed. So I know he was very concerned with how he was portrayed. I think he had a quote, it's like, just don't make me look foolish. He was sort of the unsung hero of all these people, and I think it's sort of a role he maybe shied away from, but he didn't want to be, cast as some person who looked foolish or sort of comedic, or someone who's trying to take the light off the spotlight off the soldier's story and put it on himself.
And I thought Burgess Meredith did a great job. I'm wondering what you guys think too, and I think he was in uniform at the time, if I remember correctly, and had to get a break from. Or
he was
special
discharged.
Permission. Oh, was he discharged?
He was discharged to do this, yeah.
And I thought he did an amazing job as Pyle, especially, again, considering Pyle's still living at the time. And it's a little easier probably to play someone who's long been deceased or even recently deceased, but to have to stand there across from someone and try to portray that person. Yeah, what do you guys think about that? I'm just curious.
I think he did great. And I think, one of the reasons, Colin, to build on what you just said, is one of the reasons that Pyle had very strong feelings about this movie is that, as you said, he did not want he had the publicity. I mean, he was probably at that time the most famous columnist in the country, if not the free world, frankly. And so he did not need the star power. He already had it, and he didn't want it to begin with. But, he wanted this movie. He loved those guys so much. He wanted this movie to focus on them, and I think if you watch the movie, there's a lot of Ernie Pyle here. Burgess Meredith does a great job, no doubt, but it it's more about the guys. I mean, I know you said it was 2 movies in one, and maybe to a point it is.
Sure.
Very short movie about Ernie Pyle. But I mean,
sure.
it's about these guys, and that's what his writing is about. And that's what makes it so awesome. You know, it makes it so beautiful. But I mean, I think Meredith did a really good job. There's a really cool picture of him sitting there in costume next to Ernie Pyle.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
Yeah, and he does look like him. I mean, you know, Ernie, I think, was several years older, but yeah, he does definitely look like him.
I think a scene that really speaks to that is the scene where he walks into the room and this soldier has like a crumpled up piece of paper, and he's like, "You got mail," and he throws it to him, and he opens it up and he's like, "Oh, you won the Pulitzer Prize. You're famous now," but he'd already read it. And it wasn't even a big deal. And he crumples it back up. Ernie Pyle crumples it back up and throws it away.
And he sits down and he starts writing a column about, Wingless, the soldier Murphy, who was killed, who just got married, who was killed. He was writing an article about him, a column about him. Oh, and by the way, those columnists, those correspondents, rather, they were real correspondents, World War II correspondents who were in that, who worked with Ernie Pyle, by the way. What are the origins of G.I. Joe, both the phrase and its relationship to Hasbro?
I think you have to start with where did G.I. come from? And from what people think, G.I. was pasted and spray painted. Any military base you're going to go on, spray paint. They spray paint everything. Name, unit, it's all over everything. And G.I. was all over trash cans and things like that. And they think it stood for galvanized iron. And then as World War II progressed, government issue appeared, or general issue appeared. And then, you know, the GIs, as soldiers and Marines do today, kind of took it upon themselves to start calling them GIs, I think mostly as a joke. And then, I mean, now we have, look, the GI Bill, and it became mainstream. But I think it started as galvanized iron on different things. And that makes so sense if you've ever been on a base. It just makes total sense. They didn't even bother to take it off.
That does make sense. But what about Hasbro? What about the toys?
It was a 20-year gap or so between the first appearance of the first action figures. Don't call them dolls. Action figures. Very, very.
Boys don't play with dolls.
Absolutely, action figures. Sort of a 20-year gap in between this film and its adoption. Obviously, I played with them. Was growing up, and yeah, I think Hasbro at first wanted to have different for every service branch or sort of role these action figures would take. They wanted to have different names for them, and eventually they said, no, let's just have an umbrella name, just G.I. Joe for everything. Even if the G.I. Joe action figure is in the Navy or the Air Force, he's still going to be a G.I. Joe figure. Sort of speaking to the G.I. Joe being sort of a stand-in slang term for, the American everyman in the war. And people have been using catch-all terms for troops, since probably time began, from Johnny Reb and Billy Yank, Dogface and Doughboys and things like that.
Gyrenes, and it goes on and on. Swabbies, Squids.
So it was smart marketing on their part because it's been going for 50-something years, and they're still making figures and still making movies.
Yeah, true enough. Ernie Pyle is a main character, but his story is often overshadowed by others. Wait a minute, who just said that? Though you do get a sense of his popularity during the war, why was his popularity so high among the ordinary GI?
I think it's because he was telling their story.
That's right.
There's little sense if you watch the newsreels and other things. It's a lot of top-down or a lot of this unit, that unit, but it's not the stories of the everyday man or everyday woman in this war. And I think, I like at the beginning of the film, they're kind of like, who's this old man who's just riding a truck with us? And they're just kind of like, come on, Grandpa.
Pops,
Pops. And before it's all over with, he can't go down the street without people screaming, hey, Ernie, or Ernie, come over here, or whatever else. And I think, again, he's extremely popular because he's telling their story. And I like, too, in this film that he writes stories about these guys, or he's referencing them, or he's seen with them. And then as the war film progresses, every time he shows back up with the old unit, there's different people he's asking about that are now missing, and he's, I guess, compelled to write about or just curious about, what happened to them. But he's the one writing their story at the time.
Oh yeah, I mean he was called their the GI's best friend, and among other things. But I mean, he was much loved by the dog faces in the European theater, and he did go back to the same unit several times. I mean, he didn't just bebop around, but I mean, he did go back. I think it was the 34th that he, and I 131st. I don't remember now, but he hung around with one company specifically for quite a while. Not as long as he does in the movie, but for quite a while. But yeah, I mean, he did tell their story. He got, and I mean, I highly encourage anybody who hasn't read his books and all of his. I think they're all of his columns that are in there that just compiled in book form. Here's Your War and Brave Men. Thank you, Brave Men. Pick them up and read them because they're beautiful. I mean, they're very poetic. They're incredibly descriptive. I mean, this guy had a serious talent. He was a hell of a writer. And as I said before many times, and I think we've all said it, his love for the GI was very genuine. And they knew that. They could tell. A combat soldier can tell when you're full of baloney and you're not pretty quick.
Yeah, he was real. He wasn't from academia. He had a pretty rough working class rural upbringing, had a really rocky relationship with his wife. He would drop everything and go travel across the country. I don't know, somebody it seems like the GI could relate to. He was, speaking for them because in a lot of ways he was very much like them. He wasn't from the movies. He wasn't from radio or Hollywood. He's a guy who worked his way into a job and worked his way up on his own merits.
And he lived with them.
Yeah.
He wasn't the guy that went and, hung out with them for half an hour, got their stories, got their names, and then got in the Jeep and bolted back to the rear echelon. He stayed with them. He slept in the foxholes with them. He stayed and ate their rations with them. He, as they show in the movie, marched through the mud with them. And, he was under fire many times. Damn near got killed in Normandy. So, I mean, he was there, and they respected that.
And I think there's something else interesting with this, too, that we hadn't really gotten into. But look at, sadly, most of our World War II veterans are gone. But you look back over the years and oral histories within this museum and even the collection of the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum, you see a number of veterans who remember where they were for Pearl Harbor. They remember VE Day, VJ Day. But there's a lot of them out there who remember where they were when they heard about Ernie Pyle getting killed. And that to me, that shows you how much of a important figure he was, not just during the war, but to the everyday soldier, Marine, airman, or whatever out there. I mean, that was a huge, huge deal.
I found it interesting, too, talking about Ernie Pyle, that, while he was incredibly popular in the European theater, he was not as popular in the Pacific as he was in Europe because he didn't go over there until the very end. And in particular, we talk about how much he was loved. There were people who didn't like him either. The Navy, for one.
True.
The Navy couldn't stand him. Well, I say the Navy in general. I mean, that's not true. But, I mean, there were a lot of sailors who did not like him at all because he blasted the Navy for their supposed soft living. And then when he got overseas into the Pacific and he saw the results of the kamikazes and he saw the burned bodies and the dead, dismembered sailors, he changed his tune damn quick.
Yeah.
And after that, the Navy loved him because he told it like it was, and that is for sure all about Ernie. He told it like it was.
Yeah, the memorial for Ernie Pyle off the coast of Okinawa on the island that he died on, Ieshima, it speaks to what they wrote on the memorial. Ernie Pyle, we lost a buddy. Yeah. I thought that spoke volumes as too. And I have a picture of me at that memorial when I was 2 years old. Apparently, my mom told me yesterday when my parents were fishing, I was sitting at the memorial.
Okay.
That's awesome.
That's cool.
Awesome. And there's big. I mean, when he got to the Pacific, he made his way around there pretty quick. Like I said, he was aboard. I forget which ships he was on, where he witnessed the kamikazes, and then he was with the Marines too. There's pictures of him with some of the Marines. I think 1st Division Marines too, and he made his way around. So he did make the rounds in the Pacific. He was. I mean, that's where he was in Europe, so no fault of his own. But he was a hell of a writer. Let's talk about Robert Mitchum. This is one of his big breakthrough. Well, this is his big breakthrough performance, if you will. He was a young man in this movie. Should have been serving in the military, shall we say? But that's okay. This was his 26th role, which I did not know. But this is definitely the one that skyrocketed him to fame. What do you guys think about his performance in this film?
It's hard for me to see the guy who I'm more familiar with from Night of the Hunter and Cape Fear shoehorned into, Olive Drab and sort of doing the stiff upper lip role. So for me, it was just owing to his later work and his later career. It was hard to wrap my head around that this serial killer, child hunter from Night of the Hunter is, here telling, come on guys, we got a job to do. So I thought he did his job well enough, and it was well acted. It was just, I don't know, for me, I couldn't remove myself from just the vast catalog of him as the, troubled film noir leading man. It's like you needed a cigarette and a drink, while he's, barking orders for me to take it seriously.
I think for me, to be honest, most of the Mitchum films I've ever seen have been either Westerns or primarily war films, like The Longest Day and other stuff. So it wasn't too much of a stretch for me to see him in this film. And I think it's interesting to me, he really doesn't have that many lines. If you really look at it, I mean, there's that one scene of he and Ernie, I think it's on Christmas Eve or Christmas Day, and having a few drinks, and just, you can see the stress of the writing that Mitchum's character is having to do, writing home to soldiers' family members. And I think that scene's beautiful. And I think he does a really good job of playing an effective officer with, getting his men moving, getting them in the situations they need to be in. And I think, spoiler alert, with his death in the end of the film, and you see how his men react to his death when he's coming down on the donkey and everything else too. God. I mean, that's such a beautifully played scene that I think, I actually thought when I watched this film, just to get ready for this podcast, I'm like, who else could play that role? And I really couldn't come up with anybody who could do, from that time, who could do that role as well as he did it. I think he did a great job, and I can see why it gained him a lot of popularity and why it was such a big hit for him.
Yeah, I agree. I think that the role was not in the speaking, but it was just in his performance all around. He did. I also realized, I was like, he doesn't have that many lines. And then, of course, I didn't know he was going to die at the end. I was just hoping for him and the dog to make it till the end. One of the two did. But, I think it was just, and even playing an officer is probably pretty difficult. There's the line, you're their friend, you're not their friend. How do you, translate that into a movie and make it real? And I thought he did a good job. I didn't know a whole lot about him before this movie, but I thought it was the non-speaking parts that really did him a solid.
He was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor for this role. And, I think he did a good job. I really do. I like you, Tommy, when I think of Robert Mitchum, I think of The Longest Day, and I think of El Dorado with John Wayne. But he definitely played the part of a wise young man who was an old man. By old man, he was the old, they even call him the old man. Mm-hmm. But he was probably no older than, theoretically, in the movie, he was probably no older than, 24, 25 at most, at the very most. But, he in the beginning of the movie, he's relatively fresh and clean and energetic. And then after Kasserine Pass, he is consistently exhausted. And it just gets worse and worse and worse, which is accurate for a combat soldier to be nothing but tired all the time. And that scene when they're, like you were saying, Tommy, when they're in the cave on Christmas Eve, Christmas night, whatever it is, and they're shaving, they're shaving, they're sharing the grappa and the turkey leg, and he literally falls asleep sitting at the quote desk, unquote. That's, I think he did a really good job, and you're right, he doesn't have a whole lot of lines, but what he does say is very powerful. The lines that he says when he talks about sending the new guys out to essentially be killed, and he feels like a murderer, and it's, man, that's good. You got to kind of wonder if Ernie had a finger in writing that particular line, because it was very Ernie Pyle-esque. I thought he did a really good job, though. I really do. I thought Mitchum did a good job, and I'm not one of his hugest fans, but I thought he did really good. I couldn't see any other actor of that age, which I think is important, because, the Duke was available, and he would not have played that well, not at all. Van Johnson would have been available, and he wouldn't have played that role well at all either. I think he was perfect for it, frankly. Maybe Gregory Peck, but he was pretty good. Well, we'll wrap it up. Let's, Kate, I'll start with you. Did you like it, and would you recommend this film?
I went back and forth on liking it. I said overall, yes, I liked it, and I would recommend it if you are into watching, World War II films. It is slow. I paused it, went away, did something, and came back, and not much had changed when I came back. But overall, even if you're speaking from a teacher's point of view, trying to learn about war and what it's like in World War II, I think there are parts of this that could be used when teaching about World War II, which is how I approached it in terms of recommending it.
Tommy?
I actually loved it. I think it's, again, Battleground still is higher on my list than this film, but I feel like, I think you're right, Kate. I think this is a movie you could use for teaching. And I think there's something about this, too, that with learning the story of the G.I. Joe, of the soldier, I think this is that film that first starts really opening up for the public, what this war was like. And I'll even challenge a few things here with this. I think we give a lot of credit to Stephen Ambrose, figures like that, or Tom Brokaw, or S.L.A. Marshall. I think, honestly, we owe more credit to Ernie Pyle in telling the story of the G.I. Joe. And if you look in this museum and you go through its exhibits, its halls, and I would argue in the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum, too. I mean, a lot of what we do is tell the story of the war through Mississippians and their stories. I think, especially if you get the chance to come see the World War II Museum, come 90 miles down the road to see the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum. You'll see that. You'll see that these stories of soldiers, Marines, airmen, sailors, the focus on that, I think, really came out of the work of Ernie Pyle in World War II. And I think had he not been there, this museum may be very different, and my museum might be very different in how we portray a lot of these things. And I think it's interesting to me to see here, nearly 75 years later, that his work is still that important to what we're doing, and I'm hoping another 75 plus years in the future, he'll be even more popular. And so for me, yes, I think it's an extremely important film for what the title shows, but also, again, to honor and remember that man as well.
Colin?
Yeah, I'll agree with Kate. I think if you're a fan of World War II films, you'll like this one. It's a genre film, and that's not a knock. I'm a fan of lots of films in specific genres. Parts of it I did find a bit aimless, like I was watching a newsreel or stock footage. It's like that line from Tim Burton's Ed Wood when Johnny Depp says you can make a whole movie out of the stock footage, which parts of it did resemble. But no, I think for the story it told, maybe it just suffers from the fact that we're more familiar with that type of casting, of having sort of ethnically signifying last names of people, of the wisecracking Italian guy and the bossy Southern guy. So I think that formula was new at the time, and I think it maybe suffers from the fact that it's become sort of a crutch for storytelling in war films and World War II films. But no, if World War II films are what you like, this one is fine. I would definitely say compliment it by reading, This Is Your War or Brave Men, or the death of Captain Waskow, the short article that's about sort of transposed and changed the name about Robert Mitchum's character in the movie.
I was going to say that the scene that we've all talked about, when Mitchum's coming down on the back of that mule dead, is, if you read the column, The Death of Captain Waskow, it is almost verbatim, what they show and what the characters in the movie say to their dead captain. It's absolutely beautiful. And while it's good in the film, it is absolutely heartbreaking to read. And I usually pull a line and read something from the movie, or in this case, something from the writer. And I thought about doing, because it's long, I thought about doing parts of it, but I'm not going to lie. It's very hard for me to get through that without losing a bit of myself, because it is incredibly, incredibly moving and beautiful. I like this movie, and I would recommend it. Is it my favorite? No. There are parts of it, Kate, that are slow. Yeah, I'm not going to lie. There are parts of it that I'm like, come on, just go. Like the whole wedding scene, I get it. They're trying to show some tenderness in this whole vast cesspool of death that these people are living in. I get it. I get what they're trying to do here, but it's like you could cut that out. You really could. You could cut that 10, 15, 20 minutes, whatever it is, out of there completely, and we wouldn't lose a thing. But there are parts of it that are very slow. But, I mean, again, to your point earlier, there's boredom in war. And, I mean, I'm not saying that they were trying to make boring parts of the movie, but there's boredom in war, and that shows it very well, you know, and I think they do a good job. Is it my favorite, as I said? No. Battleground, made by the same director, is infinitely better, but this is a damn good movie, and I highly recommend. And it's something that probably a lot of people haven't seen or haven't heard of, if I was to guess. I highly recommend you check it out. It's really good. And as Colin said, pick up the 2 books by Ernie Pyle. And there are books about Ernie Pyle, of which I can't think of any of the titles at the present time. But but Ernie Pyle's books are absolutely awesome. They're fantastic. So yes, I would recommend it, and yes, I do like it. Final thoughts. Kate, can you sum it up in a sentence or 2?
War is ugly and boring, but sometimes necessary.
Tommy?
This film. Beautiful film about comrades in arms. That's about all I can say.
Colin?
I wrote mine down. I'm cheating.
So did I. So I cheat all the
good
time.
It's a film starring Ernie Pyle and featuring Ernie Pyle, where he often does not star or feature at all, but maybe that's what he would have wanted, to put the spotlight on the men and their story and not himself.
Oh, yours was so good.
Oh, that was good. Yeah, good job. Tom.
Damn good.
I wrote it in advance.
There you go. Well, as I said earlier, I usually pull a line from the movie, and I'm not going to pull a line from the movie here, but I am going to pull a line from Ernie Pyle. And this, and to me, sums up Ernie, what he was doing, why he was doing it, and why the GIs love him, and why this movie's important. And it goes like this. Quote, "They were young men, but the grime and whiskers and exhaustion made them look middle-aged. In their eyes as they passed was no hatred, no excitement, no despair, no tonic of their victory. There was just a simple expression of being there, as if they had been there doing that forever, and nothing else." End quote. And with that, I want to thank you so much for listening. If you'd like to hear more about the events we discussed today, listen to our mini-episode next week, where we will share oral histories from those who were there. You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Service on Celluloid. Once again, you can find Service on Celluloid on Stitcher, as well as iTunes and SoundCloud. Do us a favor and be sure to rate and review us if you like what you hear. I'd like to thank everyone who made this podcast possible, our producer, Tessa Jager, and our sound engineer, Jeremy Burson. This has been a production of the National World War II Museum.